How most women secretly dominate men. Machiavelli warned us. You believe you're in control of your relationships, your decisions, your very thoughts. But as you sit there, confident in your masculine authority, you're already being moved like a chess piece across a board you can't even see. The woman in your life, whether she's your partner, your colleague, or even your mother, has been studying you with the precision of a master strategist, and you've been blind to the game entirely. Think about your last argument. You remember, raising your voice, making your point, feeling the satisfaction of being heard. But what happened next? Somehow, without understanding how, you found yourself apologizing. Not just for your tone, but for your position entirely. You walked away believing you had chosen to compromise to be the bigger person. But choice requires awareness, and you were operating in complete darkness. She never told you what to do. She never had to. Instead, she created the conditions where your rebellion became impossible, where your resistance felt cruel, where your very sense of self-worth became dependent on her approval. You thought you were leading, but leadership requires followers who choose to follow. What you have is something far more sophisticated, a dynamic where your choices have been narrowed to a single acceptable path, and you've been made to feel grateful for the privilege of walking it. Your grandfather would have called this witchcraft, and perhaps he wasn't wrong. Not because of supernatural forces, but because the mechanism of control operates entirely outside your conscious awareness. You see the effects, but never the cause. You feel the constraint, but never identify the chains. You experience the manipulation, but remain convinced of your own agency. This isn't about weakness or strength in the traditional sense. This is about a fundamental misunderstanding of how power actually operates in human relationships. You've been taught to look for the obvious forms of control, the shouting, the demands, the ultimatums. But while you've been watching for the storm, you've been drowning in the tide. The most effective domination never announces itself. It whispers, it suggests, it creates the illusion that your surrender was always your idea. Right now, as you absorb these words, part of you is already defending her, already explaining why your situation is different, why she isn't like that, why your dynamic is built on mutual respect and genuine love. This defensive reflex isn't proof of your loyalty, it's proof of your programming. The most successful control systems are those that make the controlled believe they are free. Society taught you that women are the emotional ones, the reactive ones, the ones who need your protection and guidance. You've built your identity around being the logical, steady force in their chaotic world. But what if this entire narrative was constructed to keep you docile, predictable, and ultimately controllable? What if your very belief in your own rationality is the chain that binds you to their will? Consider how thoroughly you've internalized this role. You don't just think you're the rational one. You need to be the rational one. Your masculine identity depends on it. When she becomes emotional, you automatically shift into problem-solving mode. When she expresses distress, you feel compelled to fix it. When she shows vulnerability, you feel obligated to provide strength. These aren't choices you make. They're reflexes that have been carefully cultivated in you, but reflexes can be programmed. And if your responses are predictable, then your responses can be triggered. The woman who understands this doesn't need to control your actions directly. She only needs to create the emotional conditions that make your actions inevitable. She doesn't tell you what to do. She simply ensures that what she wants you to do feels like the only acceptable choice for a man of your character. You pride yourself on your consistency, your reliability, your moral compass. These are admirable traits, but they're also exploitable ones. A truly skilled operator doesn't fight against your nature, she harnesses it. She doesn't try to make you someone else. She simply amplifies the parts of your personality that serve her purposes while quietly suppressing the parts that don't. This is why your attempts at setting boundaries feel so futile. You're not just fighting against her preferences, you're fighting against your own sense of identity. When you try to be less accommodating, you feel like you're being cruel. When you try to be less available, you feel like you're being neglectful. When you try to prioritize your own needs, you feel like you're being selfish. These feelings aren't natural consequences of your behavior. They're engineered responses to keep you in line. The comfortable lie you tell yourself is that this dynamic is natural, that it's how relationships work, that compromise and sacrifice are simply the price of love. But examine the pattern more closely. Are you both compromising equally? Are you both sacrificing at the same rate? Or have you somehow become the one who always bends, who always yields, who always finds a way to make it work? 5 centuries ago, Niccolo Machiavelli understood what modern men have forgotten. True power operates in shadows, through subtlety, through the manipulation of perception itself. He wrote about princes and kingdoms, but his deepest insights were about human nature and how those who appear weakest often wield the most devastating control. You've been reading his lessons wrong, applying them to business and politics while missing the war being waged in your own home. Machiavelli never said that power required brutality. He said that power required understanding of human nature, of motivation, of the invisible forces that drive behavior. The prince who rules through fear alone is crude and ultimately fragile. The prince who rules through the careful management of perception, through the strategic use of love and fear in perfect balance, becomes unshakable. The woman in your life has read this lesson in ways you never have. She understands that direct confrontation is the tool of the amateur. Why fight a battle when you can ensure the battle never needs to happen? Why force compliance when you can create the conditions where compliance feels like choice? Why demand submission when you can engineer devotion? She doesn't need to study political theory to understand these principles. They're embedded in the very fabric of feminine psychology, refined through generations of operating in a world where direct power was forbidden. When you can't rule through force, you learn to rule through influence. When you can't demand obedience, you learn to inspire it. When you can't control through fear, you learn to control through love. But this isn't manipulation in the crude sense. It's artistry. It's the difference between a sledgehammer and a scalpel, between a thunderstorm and erosion. The sledgehammer announces its presence and creates immediate resistance. The scalpel operates so precisely that you barely feel the cut. The thunderstorm provokes you to seek shelter. Erosion shapes the landscape so gradually that you never notice the change until the familiar has become completely transformed. You've been taught to recognize and resist obvious forms of control, but you've never developed defenses against this more sophisticated approach. You can spot a manipulator from a mile away, the kind who makes demands, who threatens, who uses guilt as a weapon. But you can't see the one who makes you want to give her what she wants, who makes you feel like your sacrifice is noble, who makes you believe that your increasing accommodation is evidence of your growing maturity. This is why your relationships feel so confusing. You know something is wrong, but you can't identify what it is. You feel constrained, but you can't point to the constraints. You sense manipulation, but you can't prove it. The evidence is everywhere and nowhere, obvious and invisible, undeniable and unprovable. She doesn't need to raise her voice or make demands. Instead, she creates the conditions where your choices become inevitable, where your thoughts align with her desires without you ever recognizing the shift. Through carefully timed silences, strategic vulnerability, and the masterful use of your own protective instincts against you, she builds a prison of your own making, one where you hold the keys but never think to use them. Watch how she responds to your resistance. She doesn't fight it directly. That would be amateur hour. Instead, she becomes distant, not angry, but disappointed. She doesn't accuse you of being selfish. She simply becomes sad that you don't understand her needs. She doesn't demand your attention. She just becomes unavailable when you want hers. She doesn't punish your independence. She just rewards your dependence so consistently that independence begins to feel like self-sabotage. This is control through environmental design. She doesn't change your mind. She changes the conditions under which you use your mind. She doesn't force your decisions. She curates the information and emotional context that inform your decisions. She doesn't limit your choices. She just makes the choices that serve her interests feel like the only ones that make sense. You think you're having conversations, but you're actually being guided through a maze. Every path you consider has been anticipated. Every objection you raise has been prepared for. Every emotional response you experience has been factored into the equation. You're not talking to her. You're talking to a system that has been designed to channel your thoughts in specific directions. The most brilliant aspect of this approach is that it makes you complicit in your own control. You're not just a victim of manipulation, you're a participant in it. Your own psychology becomes the mechanism of your constraint. Your own values become the tools of your limitation. Your own love becomes the weapon used against you. This is why breaking free feels so impossible. You're not just fighting against her preferences. You're fighting against your own need to be good, to be consistent, to be the kind of man you respect. The system doesn't just control your behavior, it controls your very sense of identity. To resist effectively, you would have to become someone you don't recognize, someone who violates your deepest beliefs about who you are. Every masculine trait you pride yourself on, your desire to provide, your need to fix problems, your instinct to protect, becomes a lever in her hands. Your generosity becomes compulsion, your leadership becomes servitude, and your love becomes a weapon she wields with surgical precision. You mistake your increasing sacrifice for deeper intimacy, never realizing that each concession maps the territory of your complete surrender. Think about how you've changed since you've been with her. Not the obvious changes, the way you dress, the friends you see, the activities you enjoy. Think about the deeper changes, the way you think about yourself, the way you evaluate your own worth, the way you determine what's acceptable behavior and what isn't. You used to have instincts. You used to trust your gut. You used to know without consulting anyone else what felt right and what felt wrong. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, you've learned to question these instincts. You've learned to second-guess your initial reactions. You've learned to run your thoughts through a filter that asks not what do I want, but what would she want me to want? This isn't growth, it's erasure. The parts of you that were most authentically, you have been systematically suppressed, not through force, but through the patient application of emotional pressure. You've been taught to see your own desires as selfish, your own needs as unreasonable, your own boundaries as evidence of your lack of love. Your generosity, which once felt like a choice, now feels like an obligation. You give because you must, not because you want to. Your leadership, which once felt natural, now feels performative. You lead because you're expected to, not because you have a vision worth following. Your protection, which once felt like strength, now feels like servitude. You protect because you're afraid of what happens if you don't, not because you genuinely care about what you're protecting. The woman who understands this dynamic doesn't need to ask for more. She simply creates the conditions where giving less feels impossible. She doesn't demand your time, she just becomes unavailable when you're not available to her. She doesn't insist on your attention. She just becomes unresponsive when you're not attentive to her. She doesn't require your sacrifice. She just makes it clear that your happiness depends on her satisfaction. This is love as a closed system. Every investment you make increases your stake in the relationship. Every sacrifice you make creates more pressure to make the relationship work. Every concession you make establishes a new baseline for what's expected. You're not building intimacy, you're building dependency, both hers and yours, but the dependency isn't mutual. While you're becoming more invested, more committed, more willing to compromise, she's becoming more selective, more demanding, more assured of her position. While you're learning to need her approval, she's learning to withhold it. While you're developing tolerance for her moods, she's developing intolerance for yours. You've been taught to fear her emotions, to see her tears as genuine distress requiring your immediate action. But what if those emotions are performances carefully calibrated to produce specific responses in you? What if her apparent instability is actually the highest form of strategic thinking, chaos as a tool of control, unpredictability as a source of power? You're not managing her emotions, you're dancing to their rhythm. Consider the timing of her emotional episodes. Do they happen randomly, or do they tend to coincide with moments when you're asserting independence, pursuing your own interests, or simply not focusing on her? Do they resolve quickly when you provide the response she's looking for, or do they linger until you've learned your lesson? Her emotions aren't just expressions of her inner state, they're communications, signals, instructions. When she's upset, she's not just telling you how she feels, she's telling you what she needs you to do. When she's happy, she's not just expressing joy. She's reinforcing the behavior that led to her happiness. When she's distant, she's not just processing her thoughts, she's creating the conditions that make you seek her approval. This is emotional theater, and you're both the audience and the understudy. You watch her performance and learn your lines. You respond to her cues and hit your marks. You believe you're having authentic emotional exchanges, but you're actually participating in a carefully choreographed dance where she leads and you follow. The most insidious aspect of this dynamic is that it makes you feel needed. Your ability to soothe her distress, to navigate her moods, to provide the stability she seems to lack. These become sources of masculine pride. You're not just her partner, you're her anchor, her rock, her salvation. This narrative is intoxicating, because it makes your subjugation feel like heroism. But examine the pattern more closely. Are you actually solving her problems, or are you just managing them? Are you actually providing stability, or are you just absorbing instability? Are you actually helping her grow, or are you just enabling her to remain exactly as she is while you do all the adapting? The woman who has mastered this approach doesn't need to be consistent. Consistency would make her predictable, and predictability would give you power. Instead, she maintains just enough unpredictability to keep you guessing, just enough variability to prevent you from developing effective strategies for dealing with her. While you fill every space with words, explanations, and justifications, she has mastered the art of strategic silence. Her absence speaks louder than your presence. Her withheld approval cuts deeper than any criticism. You find yourself performing for an audience of one, desperately seeking validation that comes only in carefully measured doses, just enough to keep you hungry, never enough to satisfy. Silence is the ultimate power move, because it forces the other person to fill the void. When she stops talking, you start talking. When she stops engaging, you start performing. When she stops validating, you start seeking validation. Her silence doesn't just create space, it creates demand for your attention, your effort, your energy. You've become addicted to her approval, but she's learned to regulate the supply. Like any effective drug dealer, she gives you just enough to keep you coming back, never enough to satisfy your need completely. The intermittent reinforcement keeps you hooked more effectively than constant validation ever could. This is why her praise feels so powerful when it comes. It's not just appreciation, it's relief. It's not just recognition, it's reprieve. It's not just validation, it's proof that you still have value, that your efforts are still worthwhile, that your sacrifices are still meaningful. But the fact that you need this proof so desperately is itself evidence of how completely Your sense of self-worth has been externalized. Her silence doesn't just communicate disapproval, it communicates the possibility of disapproval. The threat is often more powerful than the action. When she goes quiet, you don't just wonder what she's thinking, you assume it's something negative. When she becomes distant, you don't just miss her presence, you fear her absence. When she withholds her response, you don't just want her feedback, you need her forgiveness. This is control through scarcity. By making her attention, approval, and affection limited resources, she increases their perceived value. By making you compete for what should be freely given, she ensures that you'll always be trying to earn what you can never truly possess. By making you grateful for the crumbs, she ensures that you'll never demand the full meal. But the crumbs are calculated. They come at precisely the moment when you're about to give up, when your frustration is about to turn into action, when your patience is about to transform into boundaries. Her timing is perfect because she's been watching you more carefully than you've been watching yourself. In nature, the one who appears to submit often controls the interaction entirely. You've confused dominance with power, aggression with strength, and visibility with influence. While you've been playing the role of the obvious leader, she's been operating from a position of strategic subordination, letting you believe you're in charge while she orchestrates every significant decision from behind the scenes. True power never announces itself. It operates through influence, not force. It shapes outcomes without direct confrontation. It achieves its goals by making others want to achieve them too. The most successful leaders throughout history have understood this principle. They rule, not through fear alone, but through the careful cultivation of loyalty, dependency, and the illusion of mutual benefit. She doesn't need to be the obvious decision-maker to control the decisions. She just needs to ensure that your decisions align with her interests. She doesn't need to be the visible leader to direct the relationship. She just needs to make sure that your leadership serves her agenda. She doesn't need to be the one in charge to have the power. She just needs to make sure that whoever is in charge is accountable to her. This is leadership through influence rather than authority. You have the title, but she has the power. You make the decisions, but she shapes the context in which those decisions are made. You carry the responsibility, but she enjoys the benefits. You bear the burden of leadership while she reaps the rewards of being led. The most brilliant aspect of this arrangement is that it makes you feel powerful while rendering you powerless. You get to experience the ego satisfaction of being the leader without ever actually having the freedom that leadership should provide. You get to feel important while being fundamentally controlled. You get to believe you're in charge while being systematically managed. This inversion of the natural order isn't accidental, it's intentional. By allowing you to maintain the appearance of leadership while undermining its substance, she gets the benefits of both positions. She gets to be taken care of without having to take responsibility. She gets to influence outcomes without having to own the consequences. She gets to enjoy power without having to exercise it openly. You've been taught to look for power in its obvious forms: the raised voice, the direct command, the explicit threat. But while you've been watching for the storm, you've been slowly drowning in the tide. The most effective power is the power that its targets don't recognize as power at all. This isn't about hatred or blame, it's about awakening to reality. The women in your life aren't evil manipulators. They're simply more skilled at the game of human influence than you've ever been. They understand what you've forgotten: that true power lies not in force, but in the ability to shape perception, to create desire, to make others choose what you want them to choose. Understanding this dynamic doesn't require you to become bitter or cynical. It doesn't demand that you view all women as calculating strategists or all relationships as battlegrounds. What it requires is that you acknowledge the sophistication of the game you're playing and develop the skills necessary to play it consciously rather than unconsciously. The women who excel at this approach aren't monsters. They're artists. They've developed a form of influence so refined, so subtle, so effective that it borders on the sublime. They've learned to achieve their goals without direct confrontation, to get their needs met without explicit demands, to exercise control without apparent authority. This skill didn't develop in a vacuum. It emerged from centuries of operating in a world where direct power was forbidden, where survival required subtlety, where influence had to be exercised through charm rather than force. The women who mastered these techniques weren't evil, they were adaptive. They learned to thrive in a system that gave them few other options, but adaptation that once served survival can become domination when the original constraints are removed. The skills that once balanced an unequal power dynamic can create a new form of inequality when applied in contexts where explicit power is shared. The techniques that once leveled the playing field can tilt it in the opposite direction when used by those who also have access to traditional forms of influence. This is why modern relationships feel so confusing. You're operating under the assumption that power is shared equally, but you're competing against someone who has been trained from birth in forms of influence that you don't even recognize as influence. You're playing checkers while she's playing chess, and you don't even realize you're playing different games. The solution isn't to become manipulative yourself, it's to become conscious. It's to develop the ability to see the game clearly, to recognize influence when it's being exercised, to understand the difference between choice and compulsion, between love and control, between partnership and domination. Your liberation begins with accepting this truth without bitterness. You can learn to see the game without despising the players. You can develop your own mastery of influence without becoming manipulative. You can reclaim your sovereignty by understanding that real strength comes from conscious choice, not unconscious reaction. The moment you stop being moved by invisible strings is the moment you begin to move others. Consciousness is the first step toward freedom. You cannot escape a prison you cannot see. You cannot resist influence you cannot identify. You cannot make conscious choices about dynamics you don't understand. The moment you begin to see the game clearly is the moment you begin to have real options about how to play it. This awareness doesn't automatically solve your problems, but it fundamentally changes the nature of those problems. Instead of being confused by your own reactions, you can understand them. Instead of being mystified by her behavior, you can interpret it. Instead of being frustrated by the dynamic, you can consciously choose how to engage with it. The goal isn't to become invulnerable to influence that's neither possible nor desirable. The goal is to become conscious of when influence is being exercised, how it's being exercised, and what your options are for responding. You want to be able to choose your level of compliance rather than having it chosen for you. This consciousness allows you to love without losing yourself. You can appreciate her skill without being victimized by it. You can enjoy her company without being controlled by it. You can be generous without being exploited. You can be protective without being manipulated. You can be a leader without being led. The moment you understand the game, you can decide whether you want to play it, how you want to play it, and what rules you're willing to accept. You can choose to engage with the dynamic consciously rather than unconsciously. You can decide what you're willing to give and what you need to receive. You can set boundaries that are based on understanding rather than confusion. Armed with this awareness, you can engage with women as equals in the game of influence rather than as a naive participant being led to slaughter. You can appreciate their skill while developing your own. You can love without losing yourself, provide without being drained, and lead without being manipulated. This isn't about becoming cold or calculating. It's about becoming conscious and deliberate in your interactions. Real equality in relationships requires that both parties understand the games being played. When only one person understands the dynamics of influence, you don't have partnership, you have predation. When both people understand these dynamics, you can have conscious negotiation about how to use them. This doesn't mean that every interaction becomes a strategic calculation. It means that you have the option to be strategic when strategy is called for. It means that you can choose to be spontaneous from a position of strength rather than from a position of naivety. It means that you can be vulnerable by choice rather than by default. The women who are most skilled at influence often prefer partners who understand the game. A sophisticated player appreciates playing against sophisticated competition. The dynamic becomes more interesting, more challenging, more engaging when both parties are operating consciously. The relationship becomes a dance rather than a march, a negotiation rather than a conquest. When you understand how influence works, you can use it ethically. You can influence her to be her best self rather than manipulating her to serve your ego. You can create conditions that bring out her authenticity rather than her performance. You can build dynamics that serve both of your interests rather than just your own. This is the difference between manipulation and leadership. Manipulation serves the manipulator at the expense of the manipulated. Leadership serves everyone involved by creating conditions where everyone can thrive. The techniques may be similar, but the intention and the outcome are completely different. You are not victim or victor in this ancient dance of human influence. You are a player who has finally learned to see the board. Every interaction becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. Every relationship a conscious creation rather than an unconscious entanglement. This is your invitation to step into authentic power. Not the power to control others, but the power to remain uncontrolled while still choosing connection, love, and vulnerability from a place of strength rather than weakness. The ultimate freedom isn't the freedom from influence. It's the freedom to choose how you respond to influence. It's the freedom to engage consciously with the dynamics that have been unconsciously controlling you. It's the freedom to love without losing yourself, to give without being drained, to lead without being manipulated. This is sovereignty, not the sovereignty of isolation, but the sovereignty of conscious choice. You can choose to be affected by her moods, but you're not compelled to be. You can choose to prioritize her needs, but you're not obligated to. You can choose to accommodate her preferences, but you're not required to. From this place of conscious choice, your relationships become expressions of your values rather than violations of them. Your generosity becomes a gift rather than a duty. Your love becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. Your leadership becomes authentic rather than performative. This is the promise of true awakening, not the elimination of influence but the conscious participation in it. Not the end of the game, but the beginning of playing it with your eyes open. Not the absence of power dynamics, but the skillful navigation of them. You are no longer a piece on someone else's board. You are a player in your own right, conscious, capable, and free. Description. When control hides in silence, the invisible chains of power in relationships. You think you lead your life, your choices, your relationships. But what if your very sense of self is quietly unraveling in shadows you never saw? This video delves into the profound psychological struggle of emotional detachment, identity erosion, and the unseen power, dynamics that shape your world. Through the lens of individuation and inner power, you'll confront the subtle manipulation hiding behind love and loyalty, a silent war where control is disguised as choice and surrender feels like strength. Explore how shadow work uncovers the covert strategies of emotional manipulation, revealing the crafted environment that narrows your freedom. Discover the philosophy behind inner silence and self-worth, and learn how to reclaim your authentic identity from invisible constraints. This is philosophical healing for the modern soul, understanding power beyond brute force, and awakening to the true architects of your emotional prison. What you'll take away. The hidden mechanisms of emotional control in relationships. How subconscious programming shapes masculine identity. why boundary setting feels impossible, and how to break free, the role of shadow work in uncovering inner power, recognizing subtle manipulation versus overt control, philosophical insights on perception, freedom and power tools to rebuild self-worth and psychological clarity, pathways to spiritual and emotional transformation. If this struck a chord deep within, don't hesitate. Like, share, and subscribe. Walk this journey of awakening with us and reclaim your freedom one quiet step at a time. Tag emotional manipulation in relationships, masculine identity control, shadow work for men, psychological betrayal, subtle relationship control, emotional detachment strategies, Machiavelli power dynamics, feminine psychological influence, inner power, and self-worth. Covert emotional abuse signs, manipulation through love and fear, setting healthy boundaries, emotional silence tactics, psychological strength and healing, identity erosion in relationships, emotional programming, awareness, spiritual clarity in love, emotional philosophy of control, recognizing toxic dynamics, emotional self-awareness growth, emotional hostage in relationships, rebirth through self-awareness, karma and emotional healing, revenge and psychological insight, heartbreak and identity loss, psychological transformation journey, power and control psychology, emotional storytelling on betrayal, men's inner emotional struggle, overcoming emotional manipulation, images. He sits confident, unaware he's just a pawn on an invisible chessboard. Her eyes trace his moves with the precision of a master strategist. The last argument ends with his apology, though he never chose to yield. Darkness blinds him to the chains that silently tighten around his will. Leadership demands willing followers, yet he walks a path preordained. Control hides not in shouts but in whispered suggestions that feel like choice. He defends her, mistaking his programming for loyalty. The narrative of rational strength is the cage that holds his mind. Emotional reflexes crafted long ago now dictate his every response. His consistency becomes the instrument that serves her unseen design. Setting boundaries feels like cruelty because his identity is intertwined with obedience. Compromise disguises itself as love, while surrender carves deeper still. Power doesn't roar, it creeps invisible and unchallenged. The storm he watches distracts him from the rising tide that drowns him. His grandfather's whisper of witchcraft echoes in the subtle art of control. He mistakes accommodation for maturity, not seeing the thread of manipulation. Her distance is a silent weapon that punishes without words. She crafts environments where his choices shrink into inevitability. His mind wanders a maze, with every exit carefully sealed. Love transforms into a weapon sharper than any sword. The protector becomes a servant without realizing his chains. Each concession maps the territory of his own surrender. His instincts, once clear, now drown in a sea of second-guessing. The parts of him that once burned bright are slowly erased by patient pressure. Generosity turns from gift to obligation under her quiet command. He leads a shadowed kingdom, ruled not by force, but by subtlety. The scalpel cuts deeper than the sledgehammer ever could. She inspires obedience without ever demanding it. The illusion of freedom masks the tight grip of invisible control. His love, once a fortress, now houses his own imprisonment. He fights a war. In silence, unaware he's already defeated, dependence is rewarded until independence feels like betrayal. She harnesses his nature, bending it to serve her unseen purpose. Emotional storms hide the slow erosion of his selfhood. His values become the very tools that limit his freedom. The mask of respect conceals the subtle war for power. His sacrifice is mistaken for intimacy, a mirage on shifting sands. The battle never happens because the war is won before it begins. He holds the keys to a prison he built with his own hands. His reactions are triggers set by a carefully laid emotional trap. The price of love is paid in silent, invisible increments. His identity fractures beneath the weight of unseen expectations. Obedience is not demanded but engineered through masterful design. His perception twists, seeing freedom where only chains remain. Emotional vulnerability becomes the lever that controls him most. He is a soldier in a war waged inside the walls of his own mind. The subtle dance of influence replaces the blunt force of control. His love blinds him to the architecture of his own submission. The quiet withdrawal of her attention stings sharper than any shout. His surrender is the masterpiece of an unseen artist crafting devotion.